thank you this day for the promises of your word and for the hope that is ours in Christ. Lord, this is way above our pay grades, what we're dealing with, the challenges that are before us. God, it causes us anxiety, it causes us fear, it causes us worry and wonder about what tomorrow holds. May we be people that can find in you a God who is our hope, who is our strength, who is our rock and our fortress, our mighty tower. God, may we have the courage to be able to pour out our hearts to you, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Frank, and appreciate those words. Great job with our devotion. And if you want to do some screen sharing, we have, you all hopefully saw the email messages. You're here, so I'm assuming you did, with some of the questions we're going to work through today. So Frank, if you want to continue on, that would be great.
Sure. You see my screen mark with the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, as we start today, referenced in the constant contact that went out, that Dr. Jeff Woods, our acting general secretary for ABC USA, put together a document called Discoveries and Learnings from a Global Pandemic. And he shared that with the Regional Executive Ministers Council leaders. And as I read the document and as I shared it with Mark and Jeff, we all thought that it was a great place for us to go in some of our conversations now. And up to this point, so much of what we have been doing around response to the pandemic have been, in many ways, technical kind of conversations about, okay, how do I live stream and how do I promote and encourage giving for the folks within our congregations? How do we talk about and think about what does it look like to reopen? And do we reopen and just do in-person worship, or do we have a melding of in-person worship and Zoom gatherings or Facebook Live or YouTube? So many of our conversations have been technical in nature, and that's good. That's helpful. But as we've started to see the transition that many of you are beginning to make to thinking about what does it look like to go back into in-person worship and hopefully moving forward and getting some momentum out of this pandemic, we wanted to take some time for us to do some reflections at a 30,000 foot level, kind of big picture conversations that we hope are certainly helpful for you as you're grappling with this, not only in your own life personally, but certainly in the lives of the churches that you're a part of, because these are big questions that we need to consider. And so Jeff's presentation really provides some help for us in doing that. And so that's what we'd like to do over the coming sessions that we share with you, taking portions of that document and kind of digesting them a little bit through conversation. Mark had put this quote up, and it's one of my favorite quotes in terms of leadership around change. Man cannot discover new oceans unless he has the courage to lose sight of the shore. And I gotta be honest with you, we all feel like we've lost sight of the shore right now in these last 3 months. But there are some great learnings that can come to us out of what has been a challenging and in some ways horrific experience. And so we want to be able to dialogue a little bit about that and give you some opportunities to dialogue about that. And as I said, Jeff broke his discussion down into a variety of formats. And the first section was about discoveries around the virus itself. And we've put out those quotes around each one of those areas for you, so you had a chance to think about that to hopefully kind of foster our conversation today. And one of the first issues that arose around discoveries of dealing about the virus itself was that we're dealing with an elusive opponent. And at that particular point, Jeff wrote the following. He said, Ed Young, in a recent Atlantic Monthly article entitled Our Pandemic Summer, said the following: the pandemic is not a hurricane or a wildfire. It's not comparable to Pearl Harbor or 9/11. Such disasters are confined in time and space. Jeff wrote on, I would add matter, in the sense that you don't know who has it or who doesn't, and energy, in the sense that it's very difficult to ascertain where it is gaining or decreasing in momentum. From a physical approach, matter, space, time, and energy define the essence of something. All four of those are elusive with COVID-19, hence the unprecedented stress that it's caused us. And there is some great truth in that, isn't there? There is an unknown and elusiveness about this virus that in and of itself, before you even talk about the impact of the virus, that elusiveness in and of itself causes increased levels of stress and increased levels of anxiety. And so coming out of that learning, Jeff raised the following question. In what ways is COVID-19 similar or different from other problems that you faced? And at this particular point, we do want to give everybody an opportunity to speak into that. And then we're just going to walk through the four of these comments that Jeff has made there. So in what ways is COVID-19 different or similar from other problems you've faced? Anybody have any insights or thoughts on that?
Yeah, Frank, this is Rob. One thing that I see with this is just like every other issue we face in the church, you have a variety of opinions with it. You have some people that are scared and very cautious about it. You have other people that think it's not a big deal. So it's just like everything else in the church in that sense, that you have in a congregation, you have the whole gamut of opinions and ideas about what we should do about this virus.
Yeah, that's so true, isn't it, Rob? And you add to the layer of this that for some of our folks, it becomes politicized.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Right. And that, gee, what a great kettle of fish that makes, right? Thanks. Somebody else?
I would say this is Jamie Dree speaking. One of the things that's very different this time around is we may have had a power outage or a snowstorm or something that temporarily interrupted ministry as we typically have done it. But this is a prolonged shutdown of ministry, and that has created its own stress for people in terms of trying to cope with what does it mean to not have church as I know it or do church as I know it for a prolonged period of time. And even as we're talking about reopening, we're realizing that we're not just going back to the way things were prior to the pandemic hitting. And so it is a very different scenario because it has radically changed how we're viewing ministry and worship and all the things that have been very familiar for the church up to this point.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great comparison that you made there, Jamie, about a snowstorm. And we all know that you get up and you make the big call. Okay, fine, we're not going to have worship. And there's a level of stress and anxiety that goes with that decision. And what do we do in the meantime? But when you're talking what now has stretched into nearly 3 months, that's a different animal to get your arms around. Yeah.
And circling back to Pastor Rob Rice's comment, I think there are certainly issues in which church families are divided, but often in the midst of crisis, I don't know that that's always been true. I think many times, whether that's the earthquake in Haiti or the hurricane in Puerto Rico or even local disaster, the church by and large has been solidified, unified in saying we're going to respond to this, and we know exactly how we're going to respond to it because we've always responded in the same way. And this time, I do think it's been much more divisive and caused a lot more stress, having a variety of opinions and not being certain how to respond. I think that's made it a lot more challenging. I agree, Pastor Rob.
Well, and part of the issue around that is with this, you don't have. I don't want to say you don't have clear science about it, because we do, but if you know, just for example, like mask, we need to wear masks. We don't need to wear masks. I mean, people can find evidence to support whatever their opinion is, and that's what's difficult about this, is that there's not even the guidelines. There's been a lot of murkiness around this, and there hasn't been it hasn't been one size fits all or a real easy statement. For example, even the idea that a lot of people have in our state that Governor Wolf has forced the churches to close, which is absolutely not true, but there's murkiness, and so people aren't sure what to think or how to respond.
Pastor Tim Munson has his hand up, I see. Pastor Tim, you want to share a thought?
Yep. I wanted to actually piggyback on something that Pastor Jamie said. And what we're finding is we are reopening. In fact, my profile picture is the service that we had this past Sunday out of the parking lot. But as we're reopening, we are trying to let go of some of the things that we found useful in the transition, in the really shutdown time, the lockdown time. And people now are saying, well, don't stop all those Zoom meetings. Don't, because there's some people that are still feeling that pressure to keep themselves inside, whether it's health reasons or family members saying that. But now we have this anxiety of, well, not only what are we doing going forward, but do we really have to hold on to all these things? And now they're really going to be extra things that will be very helpful, but to a very small number of people in the church. Do we just give up on those people who only want to connect in the Zoom meeting?
Yes, some questions around the capacity concerns in light of all this. Wow. Yeah.
Yep. And Pastor Jeff Collins, you had your hand up, but then I don't know if you put it down, or did you have something you wanted to share?
Well, you had mentioned that we're in uncharted waters, but we've been talking about that for years now. That the church is sort of looking for what we're going to be next, what we're going to look like next, and in some ways, COVID-19 has forced us into some areas that we've been very uncomfortable with, and I think God is using it to mold us. And you talk about being courageous enough to leave the shore. The problem is now, as was just said, we've got people who want to go back to the same shore, and I think God is moving us to another land, and we need to keep our eyes on the horizon to see where God is leading us, not dropping the things that we've gained, but adding them, incorporating them, and again, for us, when we go back into a building, I know my people are not all going to be there, and they've got to be included, and we now have the technology to include them, and we're going to explore that as best we can.
That's a great insight, Jeff. And I think we've said in the last couple of weeks that in some ways the move back to in-person worship is going to be more challenging for some of the very reasons you've highlighted, right? Because we do have people that are going to be all across the spectrum on that, and they're going to want to kind of take that adventurer spirit that's been kind of unleashed over these last week and move forward with it. And there are others that are going to go, yeah, I've had enough of living like Survivor. I'm more than happy to go back, right?
Right, and most of us were shell-shocked from having done all the work to get to where we are now. Going back means we've got to do a whole new set of technology. We know what the technology is, but I mean, in my case, we're now premiering, and we can't use that technology when we go back in the church. So now we've got to buy cameras. Now we got to figure out how to use them and to live stream and to really use the software for worship that we've been piddling with for a few years now, but really not using. So yeah, it's another steep hill to climb. It's going to be a lot of work, and we're going to need our next pastor's retreat really bad.
Amen, amen.
Well, and just to say again, back to what we experienced a couple weeks ago when we did the poll, y'all need to take some time to be right, to carve that out, because otherwise we're going to have a bunch of puddles in every community, and that puddle is going to be the pastor. We're going to all call y'all Pastor Puddle, right? So, that'll preach, Mark.
Yeah,
I'm gonna write that down.
What?
Yeah,
One
Frank,
other.
let me piggyback on that by saying that, you know, in my situation, it's kind of a unique challenge. I was actually scheduled to start a sabbatical here this week. And because of this crisis, it really kind of threw everything into a quandary, because it truly wasn't a matter of, okay, well, my church can't make it through this without me. It was really more a matter of my plans got completely turned upside down about what I was going to do for the sabbatical and everything. But I'm already experiencing a certain amount of, boy, that ramped up stress is just taking its toll. And I take to heart what you're saying. You know, it's a challenge to find ways to find those downtimes in the midst of, you know, as Jeff was just saying, you know, it's not just, okay, we had to get through the temporary time of trying to figure out how to do worship online and so forth. But now there's a whole nother level of stress in reopening. How do we do that on multiple levels with multiple perspectives and concern for not only the church that wants to come back, but the church that's not ready to come back? How do we do that without creating two separate churches? How do we stay unified that way? So there's a lot of new stressors that we're adding to the plate that will take its toll if we're not attentive to how am I doing in the midst of this.
Yep. And let me just say, new experience for me. On Monday, my adult son, Luke, was feeling very nauseated, was really sick, and started to cough. My wife went to the CDC website, punched in all of the symptoms, and came up that it could be COVID, so he needed to be tested, which meant at that moment, Luke self-isolated in his room, and all of the rest of us isolated, waiting after he went to Evangelical Hospital for his test. It was 48 hours. And during that 48 hours, we started to work through what this was going to look like if we needed a 14-day quarantine. Who was going to get our groceries, what we were going to do as a family, how much of this information were we going to share with the rest of the family. And so we went through this 48-hour moment of real uncertainty about what life was going to look like for the next 14 days. Tests came back. They were negative. It turns out he had a stomach bug that passed in 24 hours. Very grateful for that. But the thought occurred to me, like, how many times are all of us going to have to perhaps go through that scenario? How many times are our church family members going to go through that scenario? Are they going to be forthcoming in telling us that they're going through tests? Are they going to be mindful of those they might expose? Because we could have said, well, we're blowing this off and we're just going to go out anyways, which we didn't. But just so much uncertainty moving forward in that single 48-hour, maybe 72-hour experience. It was pretty crazy for a little while, for sure. And we were all feeling pretty stressed about, could we be dealing with the virus at this point? And one final thought was, in some ways, I was kind of hoping it was positive. I was like, let's just get this over with and get on the other side, because now we're still vulnerable, right? And we could do this again. So just crazy, crazy, crazy.
Any other thoughts on that particular question?
Thanks, Pastor Melody. Yep.
This is David, and thought I would just, I think something that's different about this prom, it's it's a novel coronavirus, meaning it's new. And a lot of proms we face as pastors, we face them in different situations or at a previous church, and this is, because it's new, it's different. and we're still finding out so much about it, like you said.
Mhm.
I think it's just,
Yeah, yeah, it's brand new for everyone. When you know, I think it may have been Jamie that had mentioned, and Rob, I think too, there about the science of it all. And when you have the experts get on TV and go, "Yeah, I got nothing. I really don't know what to tell you. We're not sure. You know what it all means." That just increases that level of anxiety for sure. Sure. Well, the next section that Jeff raised as a discovery is under the headline of New Heroes and a Non-Human Entity. And there he wrote the following. He said, "In my area, doctors, nurses, and first responders are now receiving well-deserved thank yous. Discounts at restaurants, salons, and other retail stores, days of the week and month, dedications, etc. What and whom a society rewards influences the culture of that society. Some of this happened after 9/11, but then we still had a human enemy. You cannot shoot a virus. Will recognizing these heroes and banding together to defeat a non-human enemy lead to a greater appreciation of our community and less emphasis upon destroying someone else's community?" I mean, there's a question that's contained even in that statement, but then he goes on and puts as the discovery question, who are some of the personal heroes that you can identify amidst this global pandemic, and how can you recognize them? And before anybody else answers, I'm going to let Mark give the answer that he gave to me as we chatted about the presentation today. So, buddy, I set you up. I teed you up, put that tee in high so you can hit this one straight down the fairway. So
I appreciate that. And just to say, all of you, in my mind, are such amazing unsung heroes. Pastoral leaders have been heroes who have often not received the accolades or the recognition that you all deserve. As has already been mentioned, you tackled new technologies, you tackled adaptation, you have been on the front line doing counseling, talking to people, you have helped those that have been grieving, you have stepped up to help those that have lost their jobs, that needed food and other resources. You have guided your congregation, and in my head, that unsung hero, in my mind, you all are amazing unsung heroes for taking care of the communities, for being the under shepherds God entrusted those flocks to your care. And you all are doing an awesome job. Super appreciative for all of you. And the fact is, I think all of you are unsung heroes, but maybe there are some others that you want to mention as well.
Well, and just to say, this will be available as a YouTube file. So you can take this section out, clip it, and give it to your pastoral relations committee when it comes time for budget. Just saying.
Who are some unsung heroes in your church, in your community? And I'm sure there are a bunch that are stepping up in ways you didn't expect.
The next president of the United States, Fauci.
For sure.
I think one of the pleasant surprises that I have seen is new partnerships in mission to the community. We have found that folks in our community, for example, are willing to help us in our food pantry efforts. When we started to run low, we would buy our groceries from Aldi's and some of these other places, and they refused to sell it to us in the bulk that we needed once this started. So we just put out a cry for help, and a bunch of people stepped up, which, you know, kind of gave them some ownership of the ministry. And again, it was a silver lining to the cloud, and has been very pleasant aspect of this. I'm also finding that within the church that folks have also stepped up and said, boy, since we can't meet together on Sunday morning, we need to find ways to touch one another, whether it's virtually or by telephone or by cards and notes and whatnot. So the church has, in many ways, I think, become more vital in this. And boy, I hope that carries through. It certainly makes us a healthier place from that standpoint.
That's a great offer, Dan. And I've heard that repeated from a number of other pastors, that these folks that were involved but not really engaged in the life of the congregation, suddenly it's like, who put a quarter in them? And God has taken, again, a horrible situation and used it to his glory in the life of those individuals, right, for the betterment of ministry in the lives of congregations. And that they are heroes, absolutely. And like you said, pray that moving forward, they would continue that level of engagement in ministry in some new ways. That's cool. Thanks.
One of the things that we realized is that since we are anticipating, even though we are gathering again for worship this coming Sunday for the first time, we know that more than half of our congregation won't be there for a while. And some of those folks are not online. From what I'm seeing in the Barna research, they're saying more than 40% of your congregation is not going to these online services and so forth. So we're starting to realize we need to do some proactive things to connect and engage with these folks, like sending out the sermons, by snail mail, sending out what is in the email blasts right now, the announcements that would normally be in the bulletins, that kind of thing. Whether we drop them off or whether we put them in the snail mail to get to them, we just got to find other ways to do business.
It's been fun too. Pastor Rodney Smalls isn't on the call. However, I know the Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church went to, I think, Pinnacle Healthcare and had goodie bags and packages that they went masked and practiced social distancing, but shared their appreciation. And I've heard others who have sung, have gotten together outside the doors, outside of a facility, and expressed their appreciation to some of the medical teams. So it's been great finding some new ways to share appreciation to those that have been on the front line. So that's been fun. Maybe some of you have had similar experiences in doing that. All right.
The next piece that Jeff lifted up was about a new dance partner. Of course, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers. Mark said he went old school, as we talked about. I think that's iconic, though. So perfect. This is what Jeff had to share. Everyone wants to know when this will end, said Debbie Sridhar, a public health expert at the University of Edinburgh. That isn't the right question, he said. The right question is, how will we continue with this new reality? More and more, I'm hearing persons admit that they'll never be able to return to pre-pandemic days. The new normal comes with new parameters. As we return to shopping areas and church buildings, it must be done with social distancing, wearing masks, and constant cleaning. These are evidences that this virus is still very present among us. Even after a vaccine is discovered, the culture will not be the same after discovering a new vulnerability about ourselves. No one wants to dance with a virus, but we may need to learn how to dance with the effects caused by it. And the question coming out of that is what are some of the new realities created by COVID-19? And I think we've already started to have some of that conversation even today. But I think you as leaders really do need to process that, because it is going to rear its ugly head in ministry moving forward. And if it's not this fall, it's going to be next spring. Even if the virus itself is not mentioned, the change that it's created in kind of the ethos or the psyche of people is going to have an impact on the church. And so, again, kind of pointedly, what are some of the new realities that are created by COVID-19 that are going to, in all likelihood, have impact upon the way we do ministry moving forward?
Frank, I want to share just, I think it's a combination, not just of COVID-19, but it's also showing up in what's going on in our nation right now in reaction to George Floyd and what's happening across our communities as a result of that. And I was listening to a webinar earlier this afternoon that was hosted by Group Publishing, and it was talking to a gentleman from England to kind of say, look, they're actually experiencing what's about 20, 25 years ahead of us in the United States in terms of where the church is headed and what's going on. And one of the things they were lifting up is that there's going to come a need for us to really return to being more focused on how do we reach out to our community rather than how do we draw people into our building.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the shifts that's happening because of COVID. And I think it's one of the shifts that's happening because of how people are responding to the issue of racism and the impact that it's had. And I think it's a wake-up call for us in the church to say, it's time for us to think wider in terms of what does it mean to be the church, and to focus less on how do we recapture the worship service that we used to have? How do we recapture the Sunday school class that we used to have? How do we recapture all these things that used to be a part of how we identified church? And in a sense, God has created a blank slate for us to say, rethink, reimagine, change the way you're thinking about being church and doing church, and move boldly into some of these new areas. Not that we have to completely forego all the old, but there's a lot of new opportunities that are sitting there waiting for us. And if we don't take advantage of it, shame on us.
Yeah, that harkens back to what Pastor Jeff Collins had shared earlier about how God can be about doing something new, really messing with us and messing with the church in the midst of this. So yeah, that's powerful. And just to say, Jamie, we've added some pieces at the end of this presentation to try and reference some of that interplay between what's transpired in the last week or so around the death of George Floyd and the impact on our culture. That they are related. There's no question that they're related.
I think just the whole off campus, I mean, people are working at home. I think they're going to continue to work at home for a long period of time. People are worshiping at home, our kids are being educated at home. We're having our meetings, our board and committee meetings at home. And I think some of that is just going to be, that's going to be the new reality. And I feel that even on Sunday morning when I preach, I'm not, well, there's only 3 or 4 people in the room with me, but I realize I'm preaching to the whole world. And it affects, when I talk about things, I'm not just thinking about the 70 or 80 people who are normally in front of me, but to a whole number of people with a whole number of things that I realized from the feedback from the services the last 3 months. And so that's new. and different, and it makes me think about things in ways that I've never thought about before.
Mm-hmm.
That's good, but it is, and it's not going to change. I mean, and that I don't think is going to change, which is just, you know, when Jamie was talking, you couldn't hear the amens, but I agree. You know, that going back to, you know, getting back to where we were is not going to happen. And
well, that image too, Mark and I had some conversation earlier today, that there is that sense in which we're going to have folks that are going to want to go back to Egypt, right? We've been on a pilgrimage, and they're going to want to go back. That making bricks was not so bad, right? But yeah, these are new days. Thanks, Mark.
I'd like to share a story if I could. We had church outside this week, and through a friend of a friend, one of those things, we found out that there were people half a mile away from our church who could hear our speakers. The music and everything that was coming out of the speakers that we had on the parking lot. And we've always talked about getting out of the building, you know, outside of the four walls, and trying to do that like that. But literally, there were people all around us who were hearing exactly what we were doing. And the way it got relayed back to us through the grapevine was that this person really enjoyed hearing our service. And they were just sitting on their back porch, literally a half a mile away from the church.
Well, I remember too, one of the senior saints at the church where I pastored was an old farmer, and when you would go into his barn, he had everything packed in his barn, including there was a can, several coffee cans of old rusty bent nails. And it made no sense to me why he had this can of old rusted bent nails, until in talking to another congregant said, you know, Lester lived through the Depression, or was around in the midst of the Depression, when you couldn't find nails, and you never threw away a nail because you never knew when you need to straighten a bent nail and use that for work. And so Lester didn't throw away anything because he was so impacted by that experience. And Frank, you mentioned earlier on, this is impacting our psyche. This is impacting who we are. And I think we will move forward with some of those similar experiences to what Lester had coming out of the Depression, right? That there's going to be ways that we are going to adjust just because we've experienced this now for 3 months and more. Thoughts?
It really slides us well into the next one, Mark. And Jeff lifts up the idea of the power of disruption. Are you prepared for disruption? And it couldn't help but bring to mind the devotion that Chris Hamilton did on one of our Zoom calls a while back as the student ministries, one of our student ministries regional associates. And Chris talked about the difference between an interruption and a disruption. An interruption is just something that pulls you away for a moment until you can get back to what you were doing again. But a disruption, there's a break that occurs in terms of life as you've known it. And we've already started to talk a little bit about the nature of this disruption. And so Jeff Woods lifts that up for us when he says the following: COVID-19 has disrupted every facet of life. Currently, we are eating, socializing, shopping, communicating, working, relaxing, worshiping, and ministering differently because of this virus. Because of its elusive nature and its wide reach, it has the power to wipe the slate clean on many fronts. The bad news is that many of our old habits and practices have been disrupted. The good news is also that many of our old habits and practices have been disrupted. Disruption can wreak havoc on our lives, but it can also surface tremendous opportunities. Consider some of the disruptions caused by Jesus as he healed on the Sabbath, ate with sinners, walked among lepers, praised the unnamed, and lambasted the elite. Each one created unprecedented pandemonium and unparalleled prospects. I just love the way that he turned that phrase there. He said, the bad news is that many of our old habits and practices have been disrupted, but the good news is that many of our old habits and practices have been disrupted. And I've heard that already today in some of your sharing. And the challenge that we face, right, in the church is that for many of our constituents, it is, they want this to be seen as an interruption and not a disruption. And yet, I think you know and I know that this is a disruption, and that God is about doing new things. Isaiah 43:19 tells us that. And so we need to be so sensitive to God's Spirit in these moments to be able to leverage this painful moment for the glory and grace of his kingdom. So the question that comes out of that, and it's both corporately but also personally, in what ways has your life been disrupted by COVID-19? And you see the image that's there on the screen is that with disruption right in the middle of it, that it also involves motivation, and it involves reinventing, adaptation, rethinking, motivation. What are some of your thoughts coming out of this, and what ways has your life been disrupted by COVID-19?
Frank, I would just bring up the example of Easter. I mean, how much more of a pattern can we have than that we celebrate Easter, and yet Easter was very different this year, not only in the church but in our homes with our families, and home life and family life from there just got more and more disrupted.
Yeah.
I've had to relearn how to be a pastor. I mean, almost every way that I do things were unavailable to me. So I've had to relearn how to do, I always love saying, that the principles never change, but the practices always change. Well, all my practices have had to change. At times I haven't felt so witty when I've had to change all of my practices, but and again, I don't know whether I'm going to go back to doing things the way that I used to do them. So yeah, everything has changed.
Well, just to say, Mark, I'll speak into this in terms of what I've seen happen in your life. I can remember when this started, just the heightened anxiety that you had, because we talked about it, right?
Uh-huh.
And I'm seeing that God is taking and putting you in this little cauldron, and he's kind of burning off that dross, because you're sounding like a different leader, man.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I'm purified.
Mark,
Yeah, wouldn't go that far, right?
I didn't say I was pure. I said I'm purified.
well, Mark Mazajan knows very well that in less than 2 weeks we were supposed to be going to Africa, and we had already purchased the plane tickets for that particular trip. As we speak, I still haven't been able to talk to anybody in the airlines, Nigerian Airlines, or the travel agency that I dealt with, to see what's going to happen to $10,000 worth of plane tickets. So, virtually every leadership team meeting that I have, I'm asked, have you made any headway on this? So that's been a huge disruption. We're not sure if we're going to be able to reschedule the trip yet or not. And that's just one, I guess, huge example of a disruption that came by this.
I appreciate you sharing that, Pastor Dan. My wife and I were supposed to be in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and that didn't happen either. And it brings up a question for me to any of you. My vacation, I've just kind of cut out of my schedule because even if I had time, what would I do with it? Any suggestions? What to do with vacation time?
So as one who was supposed to leave for the shore tomorrow, my wife and I had rented a place, and our entire family was to be together. We have postponed that shore outing. We've actually delayed it for a year because we were going to do a renewal of vows for our wedding anniversary. But we are doing a staycation. We are still going to vacation. We both had time scheduled together, my wife and I, and we are hanging by our pool, and we are going to unplug from tech for the next 5-6 days and just have some cookouts and relax at the pool and do a few projects around the house. And we have I'm looking forward to a really nice staycation being unplugged. My away message will go up tomorrow morning, friends, on my email account, and I will be unplugged for 5-6 days. That's the plan.
Yeah, and the challenge, and I was hearing it in Jeff's question to everyone, was the fact of a staycation when you've, in essence, had a staycation, right? You've been stuck in your home all this time. Now, the upside for you, Mark, obviously, is you actually have this other draw outside that is a pool. For those that don't have those, there's where the question lies. Huh?
Yeah, and certainly for me at least, while I've been home, in so many ways been sequestered in my office forever. So even if it weren't a pool, just being out of the office and kind of locking the door would be marvelous. Even if it rained every day and we never made the pool, just being away from this office for a few days is something I'm super looking forward to.
That's part of the challenge for us, though, is that most of us, our homes have become the workplace. And part of the break is we got to get out of the workplace. I don't have an office, so I'm all over the house. But yeah, that's part of the challenge.
I had this, I got away for a week recently, and obviously when all of our services were being live streamed, and it happened to be a week that our normal accompanist and worship leader wasn't going to be able to be with us. And so I really felt like I was blessed when I was able to contact Tony Tilford, who plays the guitar and lead singing and so forth, and he stepped in for me so I could actually go. Now, I was going to my brother's house in northern Idaho to help him celebrate his 25th wedding anniversary. So I actually got on a plane and made that journey there and back, which was interesting. It was like visiting ghost towns that used to be airports and so forth. And it meant rerouting my tickets and so forth because my original flights were canceled, but they were willing to reschedule them and so forth. So I guess I would say that you don't necessarily have to put all that stuff aside. You can maybe get it done, but you're going to have to work at it a bit.
This is David. I guess I can share my camera. There you go. I think of just the relationships in my life that have been disrupted as far as having an opportunity to be with people in person, whether that's my son's Cub Scout troop or his grandparents. You know, we haven't been able to have that in-person connection. Baseball, you know, all these things that were just part of it. I find myself thinking through the course of the day, like, you know, when I drive by a baseball field, thinking, oh, what did we miss the whole Little League summer? And then I think about, that's what everyone's experience is like. And how do we help people grieve those losses? Because the desire is we don't know how it's going to be even next year. I had to reread the question or the quote about when the virus and the culture, because I was thinking that, you know, they said that even if there's a vaccine, is it going to be effective long term? We don't know. And it's here to stay with us. And so I've just been thinking a lot about managing transitions and how do we help people grieve the endings and, you know, navigate, I think, which is still this kind of wilderness experience, or use a Pentecostal kind of new life experience, Book of Acts kind of journey for the new church, you know, into what is going to be something new that is, I don't think is yet to fully emerge.
Well said, Dave. Well said. Well, as we mentioned before, we wanted to add another segment that wasn't a part of what Jeff Woods was sharing in his document, and that is the whole issue of just the compounding stresses, the piling on of stressors that we've all experienced in our nation over these last week and a half or so. Along with the pandemic, there are other significant stresses that we're facing. These now include protests, civil unrest, and even the threat of violence in our community. And the question is two questions. How is that reshaping plans previously created by your church family? And then a second layer, how has adding the layer of protest impacted your situation? And for some, in our regional family, that there may not be an impact to it. But for others of you, there absolutely has been an impact. And there is a relationship, obviously, between these in terms of the level of stress that is being added to our life together. So we wanted to give you, even if, albeit briefly, kind of an opportunity to kind of voice your sense of the interrelatedness of these two stressors and how that's impacting life and ministry right now.
Well, I got a call last Thursday or Friday from one of the pastors in the inner city of Erie that I have a relationship with. Well, he's the American Baptist Church, Second Baptist of Erie. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he was kind of saying, well, you know, you think the white pastors are, you know, get in on this? And I would like to say I had a plan already. I hadn't thought anything about it. And, you know, I said to him, I said, well, Lamont, I'm willing, but I don't know what to do. And I don't want to just start swinging wildly and then not be useful. I said, you know, I'm willing to be educated, but I don't really know what to do. And he said, well, you know, what about the other Oil Creek pastors? And I said, outside of those of us that are in the city, I don't think this is on these people's radar. You know, I mean, if you're in Union City or Titusville, Erie might just well be the dark side of the moon as far as these issues go. Right. And so stress, yes, more stress. not really knowing what to do with that. So that's that.
Yeah. Thanks for transparency, man.
I would say too, most of you know, I have a ethnically, culturally diverse family with all different skin tones. So on Sunday, my daughter Mariah went to a peaceful protest in Williamsport at noon. Then my wife and my daughter attended that protest, another protest at 5 p.m. In Williamsport. And it was important in listening. The church that I often attend, Love Unlimited, I was hearing from African-American leaders how important it was for Euro brothers and sisters to see them stand with them on this issue, and presence was a big part of that. They were super grateful for presence. And I actually, Frank and I have been in contact with Pastor Rodney Smalls, and Rodney said the same thing. We just need to know that you're supportive of our concerns. But along with that, there are folks at the protest that are not masked, that are not observing social distancing. And so we want to be there and be supportive, but it is such a complex issue, knowing that the very protest could also be prolonging this pandemic. So it's challenging for sure. And you're right, I was thinking Shingle House, not an issue, right? Maybe Grace Crossings, you know, Wesleyville, our ethnically diverse congregations, this is a huge issue right now. How do we support our brothers and sisters?
Well, and just to say, Mark, related to that, and this is a comment to Mark McCallan, that I think that's really a challenge for each of us personally, because while we can say, well, this doesn't impact me, the reality is it does, because we are a part of this country. And some of the injustices that have been perpetrated upon others that are a part of one nation under God, it does impact us. It does impact us collectively, and kind of how we get our heads and our hearts around that is a challenge, and it is one more layer that we're dealing with right now.
You know, Mark,
go ahead.
Having been raised in Emporium, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Shingle House, and you know, and being in an ethnically diverse congregation now, as you mentioned, I can't agree more with what Frank just said. I think perhaps in many ways, in sheltered communities like Shingle House and Emporium, it's probably more important than ever that some perspective, some light is shed on the situation to help people to understand why this is so painful, and you know why it's so important. I got a phone call from one of our African American members last week saying, and it, honestly, at that point, it wasn't my intention to address it on Sunday morning. I had something else on my mind for the pulpit that week, but he said, Pastor, I need you to talk about this if you can. And that immediately sent me into a very, very self-conscious soul searching about, you know, being a white guy from a small town, talking about issues that I knew I could not completely wrap my mind around. And it caused me to reach out to several African Americans around me to say, listen, I need to address this on Sunday morning. I need some perspective. Can we talk about it? And I also found some videos that were up that different people were posting between Caucasian and African American pastors that were very helpful to me, very insightful to me. So I I went into it, and I intend to be preaching about it this Sunday and next Sunday, but not alone. I intend for these to be more dialogical sermons between me and a couple of our African American members, so that I'm at least being kept honest in the discussion.
Thanks.
Well, and to tell you the truth, talking to some of my friends too, the whole deal with COVID is like that. You know, they're saying, well, we might as well open up our church. There hasn't been one diagnosed case of COVID. So why would we, why would we have our people with masks and sitting apart and so forth if nobody has COVID?
Yeah.
And yet
I just hold my head.
and yet we have congregations in this region, one of which is applied for one of the recovery grants, that gave a report that they've lost 12 out of their congregation to COVID.
Yep.
I'd like to just kind of weigh in on this as well. My last church was in a small town in Ohio that was completely white. And I realized over time it was completely white because it was designed to be that way. Right across the river, there were Black communities, but somehow they couldn't make their way into our community. I now live in Dover, Delaware, which is almost half African American, almost half white, and then other races as well. So actually, I'm almost a minority here, and we've got a mixed congregation. And I realize it isn't somebody else's problem. It isn't something that's this. We're all part of it. We all have fed into the system, even when we don't know it. When we live out the system and aren't even aware of the ways that it's affecting others, we need to address it. We do need to speak out. We do need to say something that, this is not right. And it's gotten to the point where it's spilled over. The poem of the hangman, they came for somebody else, but when they get through with everybody else, they come for us too. We need to realize that it does affect us all in many ways.
This is
Go
go ahead, Mark.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and this is David, and yeah, I think for me, it's reminded me, even the question of whether it impacts me, and only if I choose to allow it, and that's part of my white privilege. And I've even, I've had a lot of time to read and reflect about some of this, and yeah, it's just helping congregations, and especially white congregant members, to understand the systemic issues of institutionalized racism, including in the criminal justice system. And you can even use COVID to help people understand how it's disproportionately affected communities of color. And that has unmasked the economic inequalities, which again, communities of colors are feeling more the brunt of the job losses and things like that, even though they're overrepresented in essential industries, and then the healthcare inequities. So I think there's those two things, and then the police injustice of taking George Floyd's life. It just has created this tinderbox of a situation, and I think we need to have more conversations around white privilege and white supremacy, and not just in its explicit forms of the KKK or things like that, but in ways that are very much just part of the air that we breathe, and we're not even conscious of it. And for me, and the journey I've taken in my life, even that situation that happened in Central Park last Monday or Tuesday with the woman, I had to wrestle with that to to see, yeah, like what her actions were like were really racist. I mean, she put that man's life at risk, and my instinct was to defend her, and I think that's just a product of the culture I grew up in, and I need to wrestle with that continually. So it's impacted me by bringing renewed awareness of my own personal struggle to deal with my own personal issues when it comes to race that I have to deal with.
I really appreciate what you had to share there, Dave, about that it only impacts us if we allow it to, in light of the just kind of what I heard behind your words, the insular life that we can live as Anglos, right? Allows us to make that determination whether or not we let it impact us or not. So, thanks.
Yep. I'm grateful. Pastor Ron Folks is on the call. He's the pastor at Victoria Chapel in Springfield. And, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, before all of this, I had some fun visiting a whole bunch of our African-American churches. There's actually a video on Facebook, just because I so appreciate their worship style and the culture. And so I spent a whole morning just bebopping in and out of a bunch of our African-American congregations, as well as I think that week, Pastor Jeff Collins had a bunch of African-American people leading at Memorial, Christ Memorial. That was fun. Pastor Ron, I appreciate your message. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit as an African-American male in the midst of all that's going on. And you're muted at the moment. I don't mean to put you on the spot, brother. So maybe
He said he's without a mic at the moment.
Oh, without a mic. Okay. Well, I thank you for your comment in the chat box, and I do think it applies to our emotions and things that are happening. And I do think too, one of the things we can do, and Pastor Mark McCallan mentioned it, is we can be more intentional in connecting with our African-American or our ethnically diverse sister churches to let them know that they don't stand alone, and taking advantage of our oneness in Christ, and being really intentional of reaching out. Not that I'm up late every night. I was watching Jimmy Fallon a couple of nights ago. There had been some controversy regarding his use of blackface in an imitation of Chris Rock. But he spent the entire episode owning some of his own concerns and saying, I'm going to get educated, and reached out to a lot of African-American leaders. It wasn't a comedic moment on that show, but it was a chance for Fallon to really say, I'm going to become educated in this area, and I want to be part of a solution, and not just through slogans and T-shirts and signs, but really be very purposeful in moving forward. So.
Well, friends, this has been some rich conversation today. I hope it's been an encouragement to you as you begin to try and think more globally about some of what we've been experiencing these last few months. Wanted to be able to say that on Thursday, June 18th, Jeff Woods is going to be with us for our time together. I said, you all are getting kind of tired of seeing Mark and seeing Frank and a new face, you know, a new voice. Well, it wouldn't be a bad thing. So Jeff is going to be bringing our devotions as we gather together, and he's also going to be helping us kind of process that next section of some of his thinking. So we're thrilled to be able to say that when we gather together again on the 18th, that Jeff will be with us, and we'll be taking point. So. Any final thoughts, Mark, that you want to mention before we kind of draw this to a close?
No, I'd just like to say I so appreciate this group, and thank you for being with us. It is just always a joy to be together. I am very grateful for all of you. Those were not empty platitudes. You're heroes in my book for sure. And so we want to serve. You probably can't talk to me for the next like 7 days. Just saying. But I'll miss you, and we'll be back
you
together.
won't. No, you won't. You won't miss them, Mark.
Just
Come on.
a little. Sorry. But cool. Nope, nothing else, boss.
You're going to be turned to salt in our very presence, Mark.
That's right.
Well, I tell you what, Mark, since you are going on vacation, you can pray us out. How's that?
I would love to. Thanks. Heavenly Father, grateful for the start of our call and Frank's words that indeed, Lord, you want to pour into us, even in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of challenging days, that you want to pour your spirit into us. And with that spirit comes creativity, comes new opportunities, comes just closeness to you, Father, and the power that comes out of that. And Lord, we do at times, I think, do put our thumb over the opening and say, nah, not so much, Lord. But I pray that you would help each one of us to be even more open to the outpouring of your spirit in our lives. And I know, Father, as we get closer to you, these things that seem at times insurmountable get smaller, the closer we are to you. And Lord, there are ways, and we've already discovered some, but I know that there are others where we can not just survive, but thrive in the midst of this. Like so many of my friends have already said, you are reshaping your church in the midst of this. So Lord, help us to be in step with you, open to your spirit in our lives, finding time to breathe and to rest, but also finding energy to move forward, even as we figure out life in this new reality. Thank you for each of my friends. Bless them as we approach the weekend. Give them a restful weekend as well, Father. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, friends. God bless. Bye-bye.
Take care.